Good morning, everyone. Actually, I guess it is still morning, so good morning. I'm glad you're joining us. I'm going to just wait a moment for folks to hop online and we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. Great to see everyone joining us. As many of you know, I'm Sarah Curitan, Executive Director of the New Jersey Historical Commission, and I'm really delighted to have you join us for this conversation this morning. I'm just going to give another minute for folks to hop in before we really dive in, but feel free to use the chat to introduce yourselves to each other. That would be fantastic. All right, let's get started. I'm Sarah Curitan, as I said, and I'm again so delighted that you all are joining us this morning. We're going to be focusing on a really important issue for the history community, and that is data collection, understanding where we've been, where we are now, and using all of that information to figure out where we want to go, both as individual institutions, but also as a community. And historically, the history community has not always done a great job of looking at data about itself, about the programs it offers, the kinds of audiences it's engaging, all of those aspects that are so critical to understanding and charting a path forward. And it's kind of ironic, isn't it? Because as historians, we're all about analyzing data and using it in our work. And yet oftentimes we do not do the really essential job of collecting data about ourselves and our impact. So we're launching a new survey at the Historical Commission this week. And we are using this opportunity to reflect on what data collection is and how it can be useful and impactful to our work. And we hope to use that too to help you use data in your work more effectively, and also to encourage you to participate in this survey that we're going to be sending out this week. We're doing it now because we're at a really pivotal moment, I think, in this COVID-19 pandemic story. We're, by all accounts, we are emerging from the pandemic. I think Dr. Fauci even made some announcements to that effect this week, although its ramifications are still impacting us in a very real way. So we felt it was a critical time for us to reach out to all of you and gather some new data about what's going on in your institutions. What are those challenges that you're facing? What are the successes that actually you've been able to achieve during this very transitional time? So we want to know more about that. I also am expecting from our registration that some of our colleagues from the New Jersey Historic Trust will be here. And I did see, as I hope many of you did, that they are also launching a heritage tourism survey. So that's another incredibly important effort in our community to gather data. And I encourage you, all of you, to participate in that as well. And if we have time, and if they would like, we'll even invite them to say a few words about that during the program at the end, perhaps. Now, during our program today, we're going to encourage you to use the Q&A function or the chat function here to pose questions. We are going to reserve some time at the end for you to ask questions, because we really want to engage in dialogue with you to hear what's on your mind and what you'd like to know more about. But now let's get started. We have three fantastic speakers with us today. And I'm going to introduce them one by one, each is going to speak for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll go into our Q&A. So let me start with our first speaker. Our first speaker is John Marks. John joined AASLH, or the American Association for State and Local History, in 2017 and currently serves as the director of the AASLH Public History Research Lab and the senior manager, Strategic Initiatives. As director of the Research Lab, he leads AASLH's field-wide research initiatives about the public history community and the role of history in American life. He also manages several other partnerships, initiatives, and special projects, including leading field-wide planning for the 250th anniversary of the United States and supporting internal survey and data efforts. John is a historian of race and slavery in the United States and Atlantic world and holds a PhD in history from Rice University and a BA from Lynchburg College. And although he's currently in Nashville, Tennessee, because of his work with AASLH, I want you all to know that he is a native of New Jersey. So I think all of you and the work we do here in New Jersey is certainly near and dear to his heart. So John, I'm going to turn over the Zoom screen to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thanks to all of you for being here today. I'm really looking forward to talking to you all about some of the research and data collection that we do at AASLH and hopefully engaging in a little bit of a wider conversation about why data collection and research is so important for the history community. So I'm going to talk a little bit in general terms about some of the research work that we do at AASLH. I'll talk specifically about some of what we do with our National Visitation Survey and some of what we've found in terms of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the history community nationwide, and talk just a little bit about where we're going or where we see the field going from here. So for those of you who aren't familiar with AASLH, we are the American Association for State and Local History. We are a national nonprofit association that provides leadership and resources to practitioners from history organizations, historical societies, history museums, historic sites, and all sorts of related organizations for professional staff and for volunteers. We do that in a number of different ways. So we provide professional development through webinars and publications. We conduct research on the state of the field. We hold an annual conference, both in person and online. This September we'll be in Buffalo, New York. And then we engage in a number of other kinds of special projects, particularly around the 250th anniversary right now. And we conduct advocacy on the state of the field. And sort of the core of what we do is trying to advance and improve public history practice and museum practice by connecting history practitioners to critical issues in the field and connecting them to one another so that we can learn from each other, share our successes, share our failures, and kind of all collectively move the field forward. So one of the main ways that we are serving the field, and one that I'm in charge of at AASLH, is through our Public History Research Lab. So AASLH has for many decades conducted research on the state of the public history field. But last year in February of 2021, we established the Public History Research Lab to serve as a kind of umbrella or a central hub for all of our various research projects within the organization. Really a big part of what we try to do with the Public History Research Lab and the work that we conduct through it is to connect research on the state of the field with public history practice and museum practice. We are not conducting research just for research's sake. We're not investigating questions just because we think they're interesting. We're really trying to make sure that we're conducting research on the state of the field, on the role of history in American life, and sharing it out in ways that can really help practitioners improve their work, strengthen their institutions, improve something about their practice. So we do this through special grant-funded projects. We periodically publish research briefs that kind of distill research that's happening elsewhere in the field, and do everything we can to share research with our members and with practitioners across the field in a way that is actionable and accessible. And then as a national organization that is serving the history community, which is a vast and varied community of different types of organizations and practitioners, our research work really helps to support our advocacy efforts. A lot of the questions that we're investigating are questions that we get from members, questions that we get from the media, things that we want to be able to say, this is the state of the field, these are the major trends, and this is what we need to help address them, to address some of these challenges that our institutions are facing. So we do this, we have a number of different projects going at any given time. Right now, some of them include our Reframing History project, which we just shared with the field back in February, which is a major kind of communications research project on how we can most effectively communicate the value of our work. Next month, we will publish the results of a national census for history organizations. So we attempted to count every history organization in the country, which is no easy task because of the varied nature of history institutions. But we found that there are more than 21,000 in the country. We also do some committee-driven projects. So in the next couple of weeks, we'll also publish a report on history practice within public parks agencies and the kind of unique challenges that parks practitioners, history practitioners in parks are facing. And then one of the first projects that we did under the umbrella of the research lab is our National Visitation Report, something that we have done each year for the last 4 years. And that's what I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about, because it's really helped us understand what the impact of the pandemic has been on history organizations and how it sort of shaped the operational realities that museums and historical societies are facing. So through our National Visitation Report, which we've done since 2018, we conduct an annual assessment of in-person visitation at history organizations. And so this lets us measure year to year what the change, kind of percentage change has been in terms of in-person visits at museums and historical societies and related organizations. It's not a perfect measure of public engagement. It's not a perfect measure of impact, but because our field is so vast and there's many small organizations as well as many much larger organizations, it's hard to find metrics that all those institutions share in common, but in-person visitation seems to be one of them. And this has really helped us see our last year's visitation survey and report really helped us understand the impact of the pandemic. So just for some context, we found that from 2017 to 2018, we had in-person visitation around the country at history organizations grew about 7%, which is fantastic. From 2018 to 2019, it was mostly flat. And then last year, with so many institutions being closed for extended period of time, visitation dropped by almost 70%, which was a really precipitous decline. So through our survey last year, we got more than 1,000 responses from organizations like yours. Organizations all over the country made a particular effort to survey small institutions to understand the impact of the pandemic on them. And like I said, we had been seeing growth in in-person visitation earlier in the decade, and then last year saw a huge nearly 70% decline at institutions of all types and all sizes. Normally, small institutions have sort of a different experience than larger ones, but this was a decline that was widely shared across the field. So just to give sort of a better sense of what it means to have a 70% decline in visitation, that means basically that for every 10 visits history organizations had in 2019, there were only 3 visits in 2020, which certainly I'm sure makes sense and is not news to many of you, considering how long your doors were closed. We found that institutions were operating somewhere below their full operating capacity for a full 9 months in 2020, which meant basically from the emergence of the pandemic of COVID-19 as a national and international concern in roughly March of 2020, no one returned to full operating capacity by the end of that year. And institutions were on average closed completely for about 6 months, and then partially open for another 3 or 3.5 months after that. We did ask, in addition to visitation, we asked questions about staffing at these history organizations, and we found that most history organizations avoided laying off staff members. So 65% of history organizations reported that they didn't have to lay off or furlough their full-time staff. But I think that is, in some ways, the story is a little bit more complicated than that, because so many institutions in the history community are very, very small. There are a lot that don't employ full-time staff at all, or only employ one staff member, and so just didn't have the staff to lay off. We think that at least among private nonprofits, almost all of the full-time staff is employed by about 20% of the organizations, and so it's not necessarily the best measure for fully understanding the impact, which is something we're still trying to come to terms with. And that's kind of where I want to leave things today. So where we are now, we just closed our 2021 or 2021 visitation survey. So surveying for what visitation was like in 2021, how it has rebounded from the pandemic. And thankfully, we have seen a rebound from the low of 2020. So it's up almost 155% from where things were in 2020, which sounds great, but it also means that we're not quite back to where we were before the pandemic in terms of in-person visitation. So for example, if you had 1,000 visitors in 2019, a 70% decline from there would mean you had about 300 visitors in 2020. 155% increase from your 2020 numbers meant you're still only about at 765 visitors. So still not quite back up to that 2019 number. We also surveyed this past year about virtual engagement and how people have moved their programming and their exhibits online to better understand to better understand how history organizations are using these virtual spaces to engage old audiences and new audiences. But it's also very clear to us that visitation just can't tell the full story of the impact of COVID-19, and we really need additional data on that to understand where things stand now and how they can improve in the future, especially over these critical next 4 years in the lead up to the 250th anniversary. And it's why surveys like the one that the New Jersey Historical Commission is opening are so important. They really help us understand how the history community is faring. They help us understand how small organizations are doing, which is really critical for understanding the field as a whole. And I'll say that any of these survey efforts are difficult with the history community because it's so vast and so varied. There are thousands and thousands of small organizations with no full-time staff that are run by volunteers that have budgets of less than $50,000 a year, sometimes less than $5,000 a year, and it's really difficult to assess how those organizations are doing without these kinds of direct surveys. It's such a heterogeneous group that there's not publicly available data sources that we can go to really easily understand how the history community is doing. And so responding to these surveys is really important. It's important for us as a national organization. It's important for the Historical Commission as a state level organization to be able to understand the challenges and advocate on behalf of history organizations. We're certainly finding that organizations are a little bit surveyed out, but want to just emphasize kind of the importance of contributing your data and your questions and your perspective to surveys like this. So I'll leave it there and we'll be happy to answer other questions as we get into it. But if you want to know more about some of the research projects that AASLH is doing and how you can use them, you can visit aaslh.org/research. Thank you all.
Thank you, John. Lots of questions for you, but we will save them to the end of the presentations. And Kristen Pietnochka, hello, I see you've got your hand up. And we, just flag me in the chat, send me a message if there's something you want us to ask right now. Otherwise, we will get to all those questions at the end of the presentations. So our next speaker is well known to many of you, I am sure. It is Anne-Marie Miller. Anne-Marie leads ArtPride's advocacy and governmental affairs efforts and serves as chief connector of the arts to other public and private sectors. As a member of the senior management team, her goal is for the general public to gain a greater understanding of how art is comprehensively integrated into all aspects of our daily lives. Anne-Marie graduated from Moore College of Art and Design with a BS in Arts Education and taught visual art in both public and private settings. The transition to arts administration happened with jobs at county and state arts agencies, completing the trifecta with a fellowship at the National Endowment for the Arts. The transition to the nonprofit sector occurred, arts sector, I should say, as development director at McCarter Theater. She has seen the arts from all sides having served as executive director of ArtPride from 1996 to 2014 before assuming her current position. And let me say, Emery, that although your intro is filled with all of the work you've done for arts, we know that you've been a great friend to history in New Jersey as well. So we're thrilled to have you today to tell us a little bit more about the data collection efforts that you see from your perspective on the arts side.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here today. I'm going to actually run a stopwatch on myself and see if I can keep to 10 minutes here. And I apologize not having any slides. I'm going to put some actual web pages in the chat box that will refer to some of the things that I'm talking about today. But ArtPride is our state arts advocacy organization. Outside of that, we also promote the arts all over New Jersey. And we've been collecting data for a long time. So actually, even before I came to ArtPride, the very first time data collection happened was back in 1993, when the South Jersey Cultural Alliance worked with the State Arts Council and Rutgers University and the Port Authority of New Jersey and New York. Notice I said New Jersey first. That study gave us a baseline on arts participation. It's part of the archives right now. And since then, we've actually done 2 updates. We did one in 2001, and we did another, the most recent one in 2015, which was part of Arts and Economic Prosperity 5, which is a program run by Americans for the Arts, and basically measures the economic impact of arts and cultural organizations by the spending that they do as organizations. And then an audience intercepts survey is administered for a certain period of time to audience participants all over the state to understand better the related patron spending and the distance that people travel to attend cultural events. The Arts and Economic Prosperity 5 study of 2015 was co-sponsored with the State Arts Council. And it really, I have to say, I believe, and this is personal belief, that it actually did help us gain back our revenue through the hotel motel occupancy fee for arts, history, and tourism up to the appropriations in the fiscal year 22 budget. It had credibility. We leaned on it pretty heavily. We did a lot of promotion and social media about it, but it was targeted for our legislators to have them better understand the economic impact of cultural organizations. And most of that data is available, and I will put the link in the chat at keepjerseyartsalive.org, which includes information about jobs, the economic impact of cultural organizations, the state investment, and student participation. And all of that data comes from a calculator of 2015 that is then used to update data on an annual basis based upon information that we receive through the State Arts Council of grantee organizations that have that kind of information to share. And so we know based on that study that there's nearly 22,000 jobs. Economic impact is $662.3 million each year. The state investment in 2015 was $15.7 million. It's much more than that right now, which is great. And student participation in the arts is at 81%. So, you know, it's great to have that information. And what we're going to be doing a year-long project starting actually next month is Arts and Economic Prosperity 6, which will update these numbers again. One more time, we have 11, we are the state partner for that study with, again, Americans for the Arts, leading it nationally. They have, I believe, over 300 organizations involved in this, and almost all 50 states. And New Jersey, I'm delighted to report, has 11 partners that are local partners in this, helping make the statewide data collection that much easier. So Essex County, I think I'm thinking of folks who might be here, Ocean, Union, Hunterdon. We have 10 counties and Jersey City involved in Arts and Economic Prosperity 6. What's going to be interesting about that is that an equity lens is being applied to this, and data collection, which had been done by paper in the past, can be done again. Audience intercept surveys can be done by paper again, but also can be done with QR codes and on-site using electronic devices. The studies, the intercept survey actually is now being translated into, I believe, about 10 or 11 different languages to be able to have folks be able to participate more broadly. So that's kind of the data collection on a statewide level. And I have to, say in Arts Economic Prosperity 5, and now again in 6, history organizations are invited to be part of this, and I will be working with Sarah and Nicole to try to get some of that information from the history organizations as well. Although we're going to be very careful not to burden them with too much, knowing that there's the historic sites and the commission surveys as well. So but they'll be pretty comprehensive. What we're interested mostly in is a lot of what John talked about now. Sort of data is like relevant, it's a snapshot in time. So, the data related to COVID is probably the most interesting and compelling information. And we use a lot of that data to be able to get CARES funding from the state of New Jersey to help arts organizations through the pandemic. And now we're looking again to use data one more time in trying to get American Rescue Plan funds for cultural institutions around the state. There's still American Rescue Plan funds available, and we want to make sure that the arts and cultural organizations are part of the recipient base for that funding. Just some information on COVID. The precipitous drops that John described were characteristic of arts organizations as well. We can look back and look at how much we've lost. I think the important thing right now is to look forward, to understand where we are right now, and also how can we be stronger institutions moving forward. If in fact we need to go through this again, which no one knows if that's the case, we need to be strong organizations ready to pivot faster and to have strong, sustainable bases of income that will help us sustain ourselves through all kinds of disasters and unpredicted circumstances. So we did this early survey with the Arts Council in I guess it was like March, April 2020, and discovered all the precipitous drops. Everybody closed. And then we did another quick informal study just this year in February, and we found out some information and some telling information that tells us that we're, as John described, we're on the road to recovery, but we're not there yet. So attendance at cultural events is being reported now at 44% of venue capacity over the last 6 months. That tells us we're less than 50% of any auditorium full of people attending cultural events. We know that the Omicron variant presented significant losses. Respondents to that February 2022 survey reported a loss of $7.8 million in ticket or admission refunds during the last 6 months, and more than 1/3 of ticket sales were lost due to cancellations. So it is indicative of audience anxiety with relationship to coming back into a group of people to enjoy the arts. We also have some information from the New Jersey Independent Venues Association, which is the for-profit side of the industry. And they did a survey in February 2022 and showed that the no-show rate doubled from 7% in 2019 to 14% in 2021. So, you know, people are buying tickets, they're looking for refunds, and they're not showing up. Sometimes those tickets get donated back to the organization. Sometimes they don't, because people are looking for refunds. Well, an interesting thing we did find out is that nonprofit venues reported an average projected deficit for the next fiscal year, which is fiscal year 23, average. This is average, $222,285 without any current or potential relief funding. And then through the Independent Venues Association, they had a 73% of their respondents reported an average of 19% increase in labor costs over 2019, which is also really interesting because we're looking at the impact of inflation right now. And what does that mean? I know I'm over my time. I'm happy to answer questions. I will put some links to this information in the chat box, and I want to thank you for inviting me.
Oh, thank you, Anne Marie. I could tell you were just getting warmed up. There's lots more to share, but we'll pause now and move on to our third speaker. And I'm really excited to introduce her to you, simply because I think she's probably new to a lot of you. Lynn Toy is Executive Director of the New Jersey Arts and Culture Recovery Fund. She's been supporting the arts and culture community for nearly 30 years. She most recently served as the Chief Administrative Officer at the Harlem School of the Arts in New York City, where she was on the senior leadership team managing the marketing, communications, and administration functions, and she created campaigns to support the programs and development departments. Her previous roles include serving as the Chief Operating Officer for Jazz House Kids in Montclair, Director of the Center for Innovation Management at SUNY Fashion Institute of Technology in New York City, Director of the Stern School of Business Executive Education at New York University, and as President and CEO of Chester Mason Inc. Design Studio in Philadelphia. So you can see she has experience all around our area. She holds an MBA from the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania, and has also taught there as an adjunct professor. She's also an artist who paints oils on canvas and has served as mentor to emerging artists. And she is a fierce advocate for emerging and established artists and enjoys building community around supporting contemporary art. And I'm going to add, Lynn, that since your arrival at your current position, you have become an enthusiastic member of our history community as well. So we're delighted to welcome you, and please share with us some of your insights.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I am thrilled to be in a virtual room full of new faces that I hope will become friends, and really happy to be building so many new relationships and bridges between arts and culture and the friends that we now are making in the history community. So I have prepared a little presentation because I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I have somebody who's backing me up there on the desk. Perfect. So there's a little welcome slide, and we can jump right into the next one. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the New Jersey Arts and Culture Recovery Fund has now changed its name to be the New Jersey Arts and Culture Renewal Fund. And many of you have probably either applied for grants, received grants, or maybe found out that what you do doesn't exactly fit the funding. But it was established in 2020 as a way to address the critical, urgent need for arts and culture organizations to get funding at the height of the pandemic. So we're talking summer of 2020. And since then, a really dedicated and committed group of people that formed a steering committee have been working diligently ever since on two sides of the table. One side is the fundraising side. The other side is on the grant making. So I'm really thrilled to work elbow to elbow or shoulder to shoulder with Sarah Curitan, who you know as your director of the New Jersey Historical Commission. And to state the original mission, it was the New Jersey Arts and Culture Renewal Fund was established to ensure the survival and resiliency of the state's arts, cultural, and historical sector during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. We award grants to organizations whose primary mission is arts education, and history. Okay, so what's different about this fund? What we discovered in the midst of all of this pandemic relief money that just seemed like it was raining out of the sky was that there was really a void in the New Jersey funding landscape for arts and culture. And even beyond the pandemic, we're still seeing that some of the big funding pillars that they have in New York City, for example, we really don't have a stable source of funds for arts and culture. Yes, to the person who asked if you can get the slides, we'll definitely provide that for you. Okay, so it's a faster and more flexible funding stream than, for example, what the State Arts Council or what different state history organizations that fund projects can provide. And it's really unique because it is a public-private partnership. And so it's really great to have people from our state councils sitting at the table as we develop our eligibility requirements, as we develop our grant making process, and as we think about how to address the many needs that we're hearing about. When I say fast and flexible, as some of you know, it can be months between the time that you submit an application to the state and till when you receive a check. And we have tried to really collapse the time frame so that you have a shorter period of time to apply, but that also we're making our decisions, we're pulling our panels together, reviewing applications, and we really try to get all of that done within a 4-month period of time from start to finish. We reach across the entire state. So I'm very proud to say that we've made grants in all 21 counties of the state. Thus far, we have granted $4.5 million, and there is an emphasis on equity and access for underserved communities. We'll talk a little bit more about, how do we do that and how do we know that we're providing access for underserved communities. Everyone is asking me if there will be additional rounds of funding offered for general operating support, and the answer is yes. So when I say that we have granted $4.5 million thus far, in our first year, so in 2021, we raised $4.1 million. And as soon as we raised it, we put together our grant making panels, we made our decisions, and we got nearly $4 million out the door. And then we needed to raise additional funds to refill the coffers, and that is an ongoing process. So we do hope to open a new round of funding sometime before the end of June. I'll say that much. So where does this money come from? I really wear these two different hats, which means that I'm raising money, or the steering committee, along with the support of the steering committee, is raising money. And that's how we're able to build our fundraising pool in order to give it away. So in our first year, some of the founding donors included the Grunin Foundation, the Geraldine Dodge Foundation, the Prudential Foundation, and the New Jersey Pandemic Relief Fund. All of them, along with many others, raised their hands and said, yes, this is of critical importance. And so we will put a vote of confidence in the steering committee in order to be able to create a process for fairly distributing the funds. So those funders, they wrote these checks and they said, that's great. You have a wonderful mission. You have some great people, but what are they really looking for? What does the Robert Wood Johnson want in return for writing us a check? What is the Grunin Foundation looking for? So they're looking at us and saying, is there capable leadership within this group that can steward the funds that we're going to offer? Do they have the ability to implement what they say they're going to do? So in this case, they're looking at us saying, do you have a solid grant making process? Is what you're doing aligned with our giving guidelines? So some people just give to health, some to education, some to arts and culture. And then they really do want to know that if they're writing a check, that it's going to be impactful. That's, those are some of the hoops that we're all jumping through to prove that we are a worthy cause, not only for the first time, but now we're at the point where it's been beyond a year, where we're asking them for renewed support. So aligning with funder giving guidelines. A lot of people have said we don't support arts and culture anymore. We deal with food insecurity and maternal health. Others will say we support arts and culture, but we really just want to give to the 3 organizations in our neighborhood. It's really one of my jobs to figure out how to communicate that we fit into a lot of different categories. So others that have funded us say, we're really interested in building strong communities. We want to remove barriers to access. They're interested in equity and inclusion and racial justice and breaking down cultural barriers between people. And so if I'm able to do the storytelling and demonstrate that arts, culture, and history organizations support or are aligned with those giving guidelines, then they're more inclined to give to the fund, which in turn allows us to give to you. So it's really important that I understand what's happening in the history community so I can try to be the translator for how it would align with a funder's giving guidelines. Your programs, all of the great work that you're doing, really, they really kind of explode this narrative of things are so bleak. So in the beginning, John's presentation about visitation being down 70%, Anne Marie was, looking at some somber numbers in terms of all of the decline in audience. In spite of all that, a lot of really great programs happened during the darkest days of the pandemic and are still happening. So this is how you're bringing history to life. I know you know this, but I want to remind everyone that it's really important to shine a light on all the good news. So you want to demonstrate your mission in action. Something that is so important for me to emphasize is it's great when you provide programming that's free. And here's a flyer from the Camden County Historical Society, and it says it's a free poetry reading, but it's really not free. Somebody planned it, somebody booked it, somebody is sitting on a Zoom dashboard making sure that the people get into the room and calling the people to confirm, and somebody made this flyer. It wasn't free. It is free to participate, or there is no cost to attend, but free programming really isn't free. So therefore, if a funder has provided funds to say, let's make programs more accessible to people, then it's so important that you're able to tell us how many people came, how many people saw this presentation, how many people have been coming, despite the fact that there's a decline in participation. Extremely important to take photographs and document the events, to explain what you're doing that's new or how you've adapted since the pandemic, and also to find places where you can put a placeholder for future reference to know that this thing happened. So I've collected a lot of the photos that you're seeing in this presentation by downloading photos off of Facebook pages. And I will not call out the organization that hasn't updated their photos on their Facebook page since 2018, but there was one. And as I was going through looking for photographs, know that funders look, people that are thinking about checking out what you do, possible participants, people in your communities. If you've got a social media page that's dead, please, please, please bring it back to life. And having photos of people in masks for prosperity will remind us all that there's some great programs that happened and are happening even in the midst of our pandemic. Okay, So going back to giving guidelines and aligning, programs check lots of boxes. This is a program that's happening in Hoboken at the Hoboken Historical Society or Museum, I'm sorry to get the name wrong. But what you're looking at is education, it's arts, it's family programming, it's community, it's access, it's experiential learning, and it's socio-emotional health. It's all of those. Next slide. I'm gonna speed it up. There's all different kinds of data that you can gather, not just for us, not just answering our survey, but data that you can gather on your own so that you can learn more about what people want, what's working, and what isn't. So if you give participants surveys at a program, you can find out what they liked and what they didn't like. You can have them fill in a bubble from 1 to 10, in terms of the quality of the programming. You can ask them to leave a testimonial quote, and you can use that on your website, or you can use that in a grant report. And it's really important to keep attendance records. So for example, if you have a 4-session workshop, you want to know, if you had 100% participation, or if certain groups of people, dropped off. And then it's very important to maybe conduct seasonal surveys. So as people are coming in, you might want to do something in the spring or in the fall. It's a little bit of work, but you would find that there's a lot of things that are already out there on the internet where you don't have to reinvent the wheel. The next slide talks about what kinds of data points are valuable. So John likes one kind of data, Anne-Marie likes another kind of data, the state looks at other things. But when I think of arts and culture, and when I think of what I report to our funders, they love to hear if somebody has developed a new program since COVID, or if they've removed the cost and said, our summer camp this year is going to be a pay what you wish. Or instead of paying at the door, leave a donation instead. They want to understand the quality of programs. So if you say on a scale of 1 to 5, how much did you enjoy this program? If you said 95% of the people that have attended our programs consider them to be of excellent quality, that's an amazing sentence. What school programs you're offering, and if you're doing any other programming. And I know many history sites also offer some arts. So it might be music, film, poetry, theater. Knowing the age groups that you're serving, and zip codes, which is super easy. And I love pie charts. Nothing like a good zip code pie chart to tell us what kinds of people are being served. Hands-on activities reinforce learning, and I know you know that, but don't take it for granted, and definitely write it into how you're describing the value of what you're doing. And finally, metrics tell a story. So you see this photograph, and you can kind of figure out what's going on here in the picture, but if you don't have the benefit of pictures, it's very important to quantify what you're doing. So when I say the New Jersey Arts and Culture Renewal Fund provides grants, that's a simple sentence. But when I say that this fund has provided $4.5 million in grants to all 21 counties of the state, and we have given grants to 172 organizations, that's a clearer picture. When I go on to say that we serve primarily organizations that must be nonprofit, whose budgets are $5 million and less, who have made efforts to diversify their board, staff, and leadership, and who are working in the underserved communities, you have a much clearer picture. And I did it in a paragraph. So it's really important that you find some metrics that tell the story about the fantastic work you're doing and put it in context with either last year or what people are saying or how is it new. And my final point here might be the most important. Everything that we're doing is contributing to making New Jersey a really vibrant and wonderful place to be. And so it's so important that we get this information so we can richly help you tell the story and help to fund the great work you're doing. I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Lynn. That was fantastic. Let me now invite Anne-Marie and John to come back and join us as well. And we'll dive into a few questions here. And I want to start off by going back to John and asking him, because I was really, this is a question from me, I was very intrigued when you were talking about visitation and the limits of what visitation numbers in historic sites can really tell us about what's going on. So I was wondering, what is AASLH thinking about in terms of other metrics that you can use for history organizations that you think might be more useful and more revealing?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's one that's incredibly difficult to answer in some ways. We've talked with colleagues around the field for a few years now, wanting to establish a set of what we've started calling common metrics of impact. But it's really difficult for the history community because there are tens of thousands of really small, all volunteer historical societies who have certain limitations on data collection and research and reporting. And then there are, places like the Smithsonian and Colonial Williamsburg and the Chicago History Museum that are, have a much, measuring their impact is something that's completely different from what local historical societies are doing. And so one of the reasons that we have kind of zeroed in on visitation is it's one of the few things that everyone is collecting. And even then we have people on the small end of the organizational spectrum that are, when they respond to our surveys, they'll say, we had about 500 visitors or something. And then, we have people on the other end who are telling us we shouldn't be measuring visitation at all because it's a kind of false way of measuring impact. And there's just there's not a whole lot of consistency among organizations on what they want their impact to be. So for some people, it's, a kind of very traditional, we want people to understand the history better. For other people, it's advancing, democratic practice, making people better citizens, better voters, increasing civic engagement. For other people, it's something else about media literacy or spotting misinformation or connection to community or understanding their neighbors and fellow community members. And so it's something that we're continuing to talk with colleagues around the field to understand what that impact is. And then we're also finding through our Reframing History project, in terms of helping people to understand the value of the work that history organizations do, one of the best ways that we can explain that is explaining that understanding history helps society make progress towards justice, helps us make progress towards a more just society. And I think in some ways that that idea can stand in for these common metrics of impact of we can have a measurement of audience reach, and we're doing that through our in-person visitation survey. This year we're asking the field to help us better understand what virtual metrics are important to people, so that we can measure that in terms of audience engagement as well, and then framing that audience reach as helping us achieve this field-wide mission of making progress towards justice is, I think, something that will kind of increasingly make a part of our advocacy case moving forward. But when you have more than 21,000 organizations around the country of vastly different sizes and structures and purposes, it's difficult to identify some common denominators.
Thank you. A lot there, a lot to unpack and all of that, Sean. And I do want to invite others, by all means, put questions in the Q&A or the chat. And I'm going to go to one of those questions right now from Nancy. Hi, Nancy. And it builds on that last question because she would like to know more about collecting numbers on online events and hybrid events. And so I'm curious to ask all of you, how are you incorporating that in the data that you are looking for? How are we measuring that impact of the online and virtual programming? Nancy writes, in-person numbers may be down due to the pandemic, but there has been an increasing awareness of organizations online and a high attendance at online events. And she'll further ask, in-person donations are a part of a small part of a small organization's budgets. Any ideas on how to get people online to consider a donation, especially when some groups cannot charge a fee for online programs? So there's a lot to unpack in Nancy's questions. I'd love to hear what you all think about her queries.
I can jump in on a practical level in terms of the donation request. If you have somebody that's learned some of the tricks of Eventbrite, if you use that as your RSVP vehicle, I believe there's a way to make a ticket be free, but an optional donation. So you might want to consider that at checkout. And to build awareness even when you're doing the confirmation. So to put the line on there, you might be surprised at how people are feeling very generous these days, and that can be one workaround. The other question about how do you report attendance when you're doing so much virtually? It would be false if you reported attendance to be your RSVPs, because we all know there's sort of like X minus Y, which equals how many people actually attend. But I do think you can track RSVP numbers because it indicates something. It indicates that it was on people's radar. And then you can make an attempt or an assumption to say, 60% of those who RSVP typically come. And I think it might be important to report both and give yourself credit for the fact that you're still reaching people.
Plus, the RSVPs are usually attached to emails. So if you're not asking for a donation at the moment, following up is really critical. Making sure those people are on your ongoing list when you're doing solicitations, or else asking afterwards for some feedback about the presentation gives you some basis then for requesting some funds. For AEP6, we will be taking data on virtual presentations. It's not going to have the audience participation related spending to it. We're not going to know that you were eating Doritos while you were watching, a presentation. But at the same time, we're going to take that as a separate piece of data.
Yeah, and when we asked about virtual kind of virtual visitation and engagement in this year's survey to try to better understand it, and this is something that we've wanted to do for a few years, and the pandemic and the shift towards virtual programming has really made it a much bigger priority. But there's still so much difference across the field of what kinds of metrics individual institutions find important. Some people are putting whole exhibits online, and that results in one kind of data. Other people are doing programming like this, which results in a different kind of data. For other people, it's about social media and putting more of their content on social media, which is still kind of a third kind of data. And there's 5 and 6 and 7 iterations thereon. And so trying to figure out how much consistency there is across those different categories, and which ones are really a priority for most history organizations, and kind of how they're grouped together is something we're hoping to accomplish in our analysis of this year's survey.
Yeah, great answers all, and a lot to think about, and a lot of work yet to be done to define these metrics too, especially for history organizations. I have a couple of one quick question, then one final question for you all, and that is, John, do you have dates for when the AASLH visitation survey is going to go out, or the next ones, just to put on people's radar?
So we have closed our data collection for this year, and we hope to have the report out sometime this summer, hopefully in August, maybe early September.
And next year, so people maybe know when to look for it again, springtime?
We almost always open it sometime in January and close it sometime in spring, sometime in March, April.
And Anne-Marie, how about from you? When should people have their eyes out for that?
So AEP6 will be collected for a year. So, and that'll help us in terms of the numbers coming back, hopefully, right? At the same time, so the study will be released until September 2023. So that's the expectation.
Very good. And then for Historical Commission, our survey is going out this week, and I believe the Historic Trust Heritage Tourism work is already out as well. So we'll keep you busy. Final question, and unfortunately short answers from all of you. And the question is, how does data connect to advocacy? And you've touched on it, but maybe you all could give just a sound bite to answer that really big question. How does data connect to advocacy for the history organization and for arts? Anne-Marie, I'm going to start with you.
Well, data is important. but the anecdotes that go along, the stories that go with the data are as important. So I think data can be compelling for one audience or two audiences or three audiences, but then the stories that connect to the data are important for other audiences as well. So I think you have to tailor your data to the audience that you are trying to reach.
John.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked a lot about how vast and varied the history community is, and that makes data really important for us, for our advocacy efforts, to be able to talk cohesively about what the field has in common and how it's doing, the challenges it's facing. It's really the only way that we can talk in broad strokes about what the field is facing. So hugely important to us.
Great. And Lynn, bring it on home for us.
When I'm in meetings with funders and they ask what work is being done, I need to be able to tell a great story, and the data is my content for telling a great story.
Love it. I want to end by thanking Nicole Primiani of our staff. In fact, Nicole, if you want to come on screen just to accept our thanks and applause. Nicole is heading up our data collection efforts here at the New Jersey Historical Commission, and she put together this terrific panel for today. So thank you, Nicole, for all that great work. I want to also make sure
everybody.
that everyone knows that we, in addition to the survey work, we're going to go on the road. We have a series of New Jersey history check-ins that we're going to be holding in different parts of the state. The first one is tomorrow up at McCullough Hall in Morristown. Please join us. We want to reconnect with you and bring a bag lunch. We'll have a little bit of refreshment there as well, thanks to our friends at McCullough Hall. And then we'll be announcing a series of these around the state in the next couple of months, so that we can really get out and see what you're doing in your own institutions and have a chance to really talk face to face. So please join us for our history check-ins. And with that, a final thank you to this fantastic panel. I learned a lot, but I also have so many more questions and so much that I know that we all need to do together. So please join this effort, answer our surveys, and we look forward to seeing you at the check-ins. One last thing, all of this information as a funder, I'll answer my own question. It's incredibly important to the way we present the grant guidelines to all of you. So your input is a critical element as we design future grant and funding programs. So that's another crucial reason that we want to hear from you. Thanks, everyone. Well, look forward to the next time we all gather. Thanks.
Thanks all.